Dana White is one of the most experienced individuals in the MMA industry. Over the years he has spent around the UFC Octagon, he has witnessed it all and can remain calm when others would lose their composure. However, even he sometimes reaches his limit and speaks out bluntly about a particular fight. Today, we will look at 10 instances when the boss of the world's Premier League couldn't keep his frustration in check. Rose Namajunas versus Carla Esparza 2. This fight took place at UFC 274 on May 7th of last year. In the co-main event, Rose Namajunas defended her title against Carla Esparza, who had previously lost to her. The bout was billed as a long-awaited rematch. But after the final bell, most of the spectators in the arena and at home wished they could erase their memories and never watch it again. The reason for the disappointment was clear. There was almost no action in the fight. Namajunas, who had previously defeated the dangerous Zhang Weili twice, acted as if she were a wallflower against Esparza. The issue was that Esparza didn't seem eager to take risks either. According to Dana White, the two women threw a total of just 6 strikes between them in the first round. The subsequent rounds weren't much better. As a result, Namajunas lost to Esparza by split decision, since Esparza at least tried to make something happen in the clinch. She took the champion down several times and attempted a choke. It was a very strange fight. It was really hard to watch, especially compared to the main event. Oliveira versus Gauthier. Nobody wanted to force the action. It's disappointing, but sometimes these types of fights happen, he said during the press conference. When a journalist asked whether it made sense to arrange a third fight between the women, the UFC boss gave an honest response. "I don't think anyone will be asking for it," White said. "Rose is one of the best. We'll see what happens." In the year and a half since that moment, Rose Namajunas has fought only once. She lost to Manon Fiorot by decision in September of 2023. Carla Esparza in her first defense lost to Zhang Weili by submission and lost her title. Soa Palalay versus Nikita Krylov. This was Nikita Krylov's first fight in the UFC, and it took place in August of 2013 at UFC 164. At the time, Krylov was competing in the heavyweight division. He had been a decent heavyweight in smaller promotions, but the competition in the world's top league turned out to be much tougher. To welcome the Donetsk native to the promotion, Soa Palalay stepped up, a veteran who had been fighting MMA since the late 90s and had once fought in Pride. Unlike his opponent, Palalay was a true heavyweight and was on an 8-fight win streak. However, all of those victories came outside the UFC. From the very first minutes of the fight, it was clear that Soa was too big and too heavy for Krylov. The Australian easily took his opponent to the canvas and methodically landed strikes. Krylov tried to work from the bottom and set up submissions. In the first round, the two engaged in grappling exchanges, which were somewhat interesting to watch. However, starting from the second round, both fighters began to lose steam at an alarming rate. The exchanges turned into sluggish scrambles. The only bright moment came when Krylov almost locked in a submission with a crucifix neck crank. Had Krylov finished the fight that way, it would have made its way into the UFC's collection of best submissions, but Soa managed to escape. The third round was a disappointment for everyone who watched it. Both fighters had no energy left. They sluggishly moved around the octagon, attempting to grapple and strike. It was Krylov who ran out of gas first. In the second half of the round, he was thrown onto the canvas by Palalay and was pummeled there. By that point, Palalay was struggling to move as well. Dana White was not impressed by the fight. "You don't want to hear my thoughts on that fight. It was awkward, like a sumo match. Krylov, it was a great night, and all the fights were great. Except Krylov and Soa's. They both looked unprepared. They were tired, falling on top of each other, and so on. You shouldn't see that kind of stuff in the UFC. You shouldn't see it. Guys should be in shape," he said after the fight. After that, Krylov went on to fight several more times in the UFC, competing in 2 weight classes at once. Things didn't go too well, and in 2017, he left the promotion. In 2019, he returned as a light heavyweight and is currently on a streak of 3 consecutive wins. Soa Palalay retired in 2015, with his final fight being against Bigfoot Silva at UFC 190. The Australian lost that bout. Magomed Ankalaev versus Jan Błachowicz. This was one of the most controversial title fights in UFC history. By the time this fight took place, the light heavyweight division was in chaos. The reigning champion, Gigi Prochaska, vacated the title due to a serious injury, so 2 contenders had to be found. While Magomed Ankalaev, with 9 consecutive wins, seemed like a fitting choice, Błachowicz was more of a backup option out of necessity. It looked like this would be an easy fight for the Dagestani fighter. The two met in the Octagon in December of 2022 at UFC 282. In the first 2 rounds, the audience quickly realized they had seriously underestimated the Pole. Błachowicz landed sharp leg kicks and made Magomed feel uncomfortable. Realizing he needed to change the course of the fight, Ankalaev switched to wrestling and seemed to control the next 3 rounds. The issue, however, was that the segments Błachowicz won were more exciting than what Magomed showed in the second half of the fight. It ended up feeling like the Dagestani had diminished the spectacle of the matchup. It's unclear whether this influenced the judges, but they ultimately scored the fight a majority draw. The draw in a title fight meant that the title remained vacant. But after the post-fight press conference, Dana White was ruthless. What can you do? I think the main event was awful. Who would I give the win to? I don't even know. By the 3rd round, I had already given up on their fight. They say Ankalaev was upset. You were getting beaten in the first 2 rounds, then you take your opponent down and start. Well, before we saw today's main event, this year was good, he said back then. The draw in this fight served as a catalyst for even more chaos. The title was contested between former champion Glover Teixeira and the number 6 ranked light heavyweight Jamahal Hill. Hill confidently defeated the veteran, but after some time he suffered an injury and vacated the title. As a result, the belt ended up in the hands of Alex Pereira, who knocked out the returning Prochaska in a fight for the vacant title. But for Ankalaev, the madness didn't end there. Magomed Ankalaev versus Johnny Walker. After the scandal with Błachowicz, Magomed found himself in a strange situation. On the one hand, his unbeaten streak in the light heavyweight division had reached 10 fights, a record no one could match since John Jones moved up to heavyweight. On the other hand, he had just fought for the title and didn't win it, which meant his next shot at the belt wouldn't come anytime soon. UFC matchmakers decided it was time to test Ankalaev against Johnny Walker. Walker is an exciting and athletic fighter from the top 10 of the light heavyweight division. Throughout his UFC career, he had been inconsistent, but before facing Ankalaev, he had won 3 straight bouts. UFC officials believed Johnny could make a solid contender, and a win over Magomed could be his ticket to a title shot. Their fight took place in October of 2023 at UFC 294 in Abu Dhabi. Magomed was determined to finish the fight in style, so he came out pressuring Walker on the feet. Walker moved backward but didn't take any serious shots.
Huge body shot, and Walker then landed.
In the middle of the first round, Ankalaev pinned his opponent against the cage and attempted a takedown, but Walker kept his position on one knee. At that moment, the Dagestani made a mistake reminiscent of Peter Yan's. He kneeled Walker in the head while the Brazilian had 3 points of contact on the mat. The referee immediately stopped the fight.
Down. He's down.
What followed was already history. The doctor entered the octagon and asked Walker where he was. "I'm in the desert," the fighter replied. The doctor stopped the fight.
Unbelievable! Same doctor! Unbelievable!
I believe the doctor asked Walker where we were, meaning the country or city. Walker answered, "In the desert," and technically he was right. Walker might not have fully understood the question, as he's Brazilian, and English isn't his first language. The doctor seemed inexperienced, which was frustrating, White said. Needless to say, the outcome of that fight didn't sit well with anyone. Therefore, the UFC plans to arrange another meeting between Walker and Ankalaev by the end of 2023. Georges St-Pierre versus Johnny Hendricks. The last title defense of the legendary JSP turned into one of the biggest judging scandals of its time in the UFC. The fight between St-Pierre and Hendricks took place in November of 2013 at UFC 167. The matchup promised to be intriguing since Hendricks was a great wrestler and possessed knockout power. However, most viewers thought that Georges would find a way to confidently deal with the challenger, as he had done many times before. From the first round, Hendricks started unloading his heavy shots on the champion. He gave the Canadian a hematoma and dealt significantly more damage. In the second and third rounds, the Canadian managed to even things out, but there was no sign of a clear advantage for St-Pierre.
Another one! Oh my goodness! George is in big!
"I'm in the desert," the fighter replied. The doctor stopped the fight. I believe the doctor asked Walker where we were, meaning the country or city. Walker answered, "In the desert," and technically he was correct. Walker might not have fully understood the question since he's Brazilian and English isn't his first language. The doctor seemed inexperienced, which was frustrating, White said. Needless to say, the outcome of the fight didn't sit well with anyone. In the fourth, Hendricks became more active and again looked better than his opponent, landing a nice shot. In the fifth, Georges found his will and managed to even things up a little, but once again, it wasn't clear that the champion had won the round. As a result, judges Sal D'Amato and Tony Weeks decided that Georges St-Pierre had won the fight by the slimmest of margins. Their colleague Glenn Trowbridge saw it differently, 48-47 for the challenger. When the result was announced, a major scandal erupted. It was certainly possible to scrape enough points for a St-Pierre victory in this fight. The mathematical champ landed more strikes and completed more takedowns than his opponent. However, the damage St-Pierre took was more significant. Moreover, Hendricks clearly benefited more from his takedowns. As a result, many, including Dana White, didn't understand the judge's decision. After the verdict was announced, the Canadian champion declared that he was retiring from the sport. It was the worst judging on the planet. I think the authorities need to step in before these guys destroy this sport just like they destroyed boxing. Is there anyone here who believes Johnny Hendricks didn't win the fight? You saw that George was rocked and beaten up in the first round. It's about the damage. George, I don't want to hear about retirement. You owe a rematch to the company, the fans, and Johnny Hendricks, said the UFC boss. But St-Pierre didn't change his decision and retired from the sport for 4 years. After that, Georges returned to take the middleweight title from Michael Bisping and then retired again. Johnny Hendricks did eventually win the vacant UFC title in a fight against Robbie Lawler, but in his next fight, he lost to Lawler again. After that, he only won twice in 7 bouts, and he finished his career as a middleweight. His retirement fight came against Paulo Costa. This happened at the same event where St-Pierre won his second title, Anderson Silva versus Demian Maia. This was a fight where Anderson Silva showed that if he didn't want to fight, he wouldn't, even if he was already in the octagon. The strange battle between the Spider and Maia took place at UFC 112 in April of 2010. Demian was considered a legitimate contender, having won 5 out of his 6 fights in the promotion. But at that time, the skill gap between him and Silva was so wide that many thought the outcome of the fight was already decided. Anderson started by bowing to all sides of the world and to his opponent. He was far superior to Maia. Demian could only awkwardly attempt to take the Spider to the ground, where he had some chances. In the first 2 rounds, Anderson landed strikes on Maia, but starting from the third, his behavior became increasingly odd. He began making faces and, it seemed, was purposely allowing himself to be hit. The champion also talked too much. As a result, the fight went the full distance simply because Silva didn't want to fully engage. Later, Portuguese-speaking fans raised an uproar over what Anderson was saying to his opponent during the fight. The champion referred to Maia as a playboy, which is considered an insult among Brazilians. It's a term used for those who've achieved everything through connections and family. In Russian, it's similar to calling someone a mama's boy or a silver spoon kid. Silva himself claimed that he was misunderstood, but the fans were furious. Dana White was in the same state of mind. This is the most disgusting and disrespectful performance I've ever seen. Anderson Silva is a very talented guy. I've always been on his side, but if he puts on another fight like that, he'll be fired, White said at the post-fight press conference. It was also because of this incident that Silva didn't get the super fight with Georges St-Pierre. However, this kind of behavior didn't affect the Spider's performances for a while. His unbeaten streak lasted another 3 years, until such excessive bravado came back to haunt him in his fight with Chris Weidman. Demian Maia had a few more fights in the middleweight division, then dropped down a weight class. There, he also became a contender for the title, but the Brazilian couldn't secure the belt. Aljamain, Sterling's fights. It's not that a particular fight of the Funkmaster really pissed off White, but the strange situations surrounding several of his consecutive fights seem to have really gotten under Dana's skin. There's no need to go over the fights between Petr Yan and Sterling again, as MMA fans are already well aware of them. Let's just recap the results. The first fight ended with a disqualification of Peter and an excellent acting performance by Sterling, while the second ended in a very controversial victory for Aljamain. In between them, there was the story where the Jamaican either couldn't or didn't want to step into the cage. Regarding Peter's disqualification, White said, "I don't understand why he threw that knee. He was winning the fight. He just needed to finish it." Right after the match, Dana stated that the UFC would immediately begin preparing for a rematch. However, there were problems with the immediate rematch. Peter was eager to fight, while Sterling didn't know when he'd be ready. At that point, White tried to put pressure on the Funkmaster. "I think we should have introduced an interim title since Aljamain isn't ready to fight. Given that he doesn't know when his neck will be fine, an interim title would have made sense," he said. But then the second fight happened, and it ended in another scandal. "I believe the judges failed in their duties. In my count, it was 3-2, but in favor of Yan," White said after the rematch. Against this backdrop, the UFC boss's attitude towards Sterling clearly soured. "When I talk to Aljamain one-on-one, he's a great and friendly guy. But because of the things he says publicly, he's become one of the least popular guys on the roster. It's strange. I don't know if it's self-sabotage or something else, but he keeps saying the wrong things," White said in September of 2023, after Sterling lost his title to Sean O'Malley. But what really infuriated White the most was the fight that never happened. This refers to the potential fight between Aljamain and his friend and teammate Merab Dvalishvili. Both fighters want nothing to do with it, yet they're both top contenders in the bantamweight division. You can stay friends and still want what your friend has. It's very silly of him to avoid fighting Aljamain. If Merab has chosen this path, it's a very bad idea. He needs to decide whether he wants to fight for the title or prefers fighting the toughest guys but never getting a title shot. It's his personal choice, and if he chooses the latter, that's the end of the story. He's an adult and needs to figure it out. Now, Sterling is no longer the UFC bantamweight champion, so White has a little less of a headache. However, the Jamaican still hasn't made the move to featherweight, which means the issue of two top fighters not wanting to fight each other is still unresolved. Derek Lewis versus Francis Ngannou. Sometimes, a plus multiplied by a plus results in a big minus. This is what happened when the UFC decided to pit two of the scariest knockout artists in the heavyweight division. Derek Lewis and Francis Ngannou against each other at UFC 226, which took place on July 8, 2018. In theory, Francis should have been motivated to avenge his one-sided loss to Stipe Miocic in his previous fight, but for that he needed to face a different opponent. Over the course of 15 minutes, Lewis and Ngannou landed a total of 31 strikes between them, with Francis throwing 11 and Derek landing 20. For the most part, the fighters circled in the center of the octagon, both too cautious to engage, which prompted the referee to issue a warning. There was no wrestling in the fight either, as both fighters were not particularly strong in that aspect. As a result, Derek Lewis won by decision. It was awful. I think Francis Ngannou's ego outpaced his abilities. The win over Alistair Overeem elevated him, and that's what happens when you rise too fast. Everyone thought, and I did too, that he was the guy, but now he has 2 losses in a row, White said after the fight. Since then, the relationship between the UFC boss and Ngannou soured to the point where Francis voluntarily left the UFC. He found success in boxing and gave Tyson Fury a good fight, earning a lot of money. Derek Lewis still remains in the top 10 of the heavyweight division, alternating between wins and losses. Israel Adesanya versus Yoel Romero. This was one of those fights that earned Adesanya the nickname Boring Sanya and Running Sanya. It took place at UFC 248 on March 7th, 2020. Before the fight, Israel referred to Yoel Romero as a beast he would tame. In reality, the taming turned out to be quite strange. The short-armed Romero tried to land hard punches to Adesanya's head, and a few times he succeeded. Realizing that trading punches with the Cuban wasn't a good idea, Adesanya used footwork and low kicks. He landed very few strikes to the head throughout the fight, but the champion almost stopped taking any significant hits after the second round. Strangely enough, Romero, a world-class wrestler, couldn't take Adesanya down or control him on the ground, leaving Yoel to only run around and make faces. The entire fight left a depressing impression on the audience, which expressed their displeasure with a loud chorus of boos. The referee had to intervene to get the gentlemen to engage. After 5 rounds of one of the most boring title fights in the history of the promotion, Israel Adesanya emerged victorious. It was a terrible fight. If you look at the entire history of the UFC, you won't find fights as bad as this. The matchmakers didn't want to organize this one, but the fans insisted. The main event looked bad, White said after the fight. Now, Romero is 46, but he hasn't retired from fighting yet. The Cuban competes with mixed success in Bellator, where he now fights as a light heavyweight. Adesanya, on the other hand, has lost his title twice and taken a break until 2027. It's unlikely that these two will ever face off in the octagon again. Conor McGregor versus Khabib Nurmagomedov. One of the most important fights in MMA history was surrounded by pure chaos, which Dana White, as the face of the promotion, had to deal with himself. The atmosphere leading up to the fight was mainly heated because of Conor's trash talk. McGregor and his team tried to get into Khabib's head and went just a bit too far. Artem Lobov had to take the heat, receiving a fatherly slap from Khabib. After that, he never said anything like that again. Realizing that the stakes couldn't be lowered, McGregor orchestrated an attack on the bus where Khabib and several other fighters were sitting, some of whom had no involvement in the conflict between the Dagestani and the Irishman. As a result, McGregor ran into legal issues, but that didn't stop him from stepping into the cage. The fight between Khabib and Conor took place in New York on October 6th, 2018 at UFC 229. The key question of whether Khabib could take the Irishman down and control him was answered in the very first round. Nurmagomedov was able to do so and began dismantling his opponent in style. The longer the fight went on, the fewer opportunities Conor had to win. The climax came in the 4th round when Notorious was exhausted and Khabib nearly broke his neck, forcing him to tap out. But the fights that night were far from over. Conor's team member Dylan Dennis started insulting Khabib. In response, the Eagle jumped out of the cage and tried to strike the offender. At the same time, in the Octagon, Conor was attacked by Zubaira Tukhugov, Abubakar Nurmagomedov, and other members of Khabib's team. The crowd was wildly supporting Conor. The disturbance was so intense that Dana White refused to hand Khabib the championship belt, fearing that the Dagestanis would tear him apart on the spot. I was at the center of all of this. Millions of people were watching us. I think it would have been wrong to give Khabib the championship belt. It would have caused a whole tornado of events. So we decided to take everyone backstage, White said after the fight. At the same time, Dana placed the main responsibility on Khabib.
He's still throwing things at him. He's going to experience hate.
It all started with the actions of Conor's corner guy, but what Khabib did was just complete madness. He had just won a good fight, and now he's about to get the belt. The Nevada Athletic Commission will conduct an investigation. Khabib's team is facing big fines and major trouble, the UFC boss said in one of his interviews. As a result of the incident, Khabib was suspended for 9 months, after which he defended his belt 2 more times and retired undefeated. Conor, after the memorable fight, won against Donald Cerrone, but then lost twice to Dustin Poirier. Since the summer of 2021, McGregor has been on a break, and his return date is unknown. What other fights that angered Dana White do you know? Write them in the comments and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell.